The potential for emerging technologies like genomics, cultivated proteins, and artificial intelligence to literally redefine large swaths of the global food system is mind-boggling. But to futurist Tony Hunter, spotting the connections between tech innovation and food is all in a day's work. I recently spoke with Tony about where he sees the most likely near-term innovations occurring and why he thinks food and technology are now one and the same. Tony, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
As a futurist, you say that your job is not to predict what's going to happen, but rather to identify and embrace a range of alternative futures. Explain what you mean by that. What do you mean by alternative futures? And then if you could elaborate a little bit on what you see as some of the most plausible alternative futures for the food system over, say, the next few decades.
People often think of futurists as someone who predicts the future. We don't predict the future. We are not fortune tellers. But what we do as futurists, we look at what I term alternative futures. So what are futures that could develop? Just to clarify, there is what we call the projected future, which is basically business as usual. Everything's going to be exactly the same. Next year's this year plus X percent. Then we've got probable futures, which is the continuation of current trends. Then the next one is plausible futures, and that's things that could happen based on current knowledge, but they're not as likely as what we call our probable futures. And most people work in either business as usual or a probable future. If we look at plausible futures, that's when we start saying, well, okay, what is plausible? What could happen? And what are the alternatives? And if we have a look at some of the probable futures, if you like, for the food industry, I mean, increased emphasis on sustainable production, some non-traditional ingredient sources. I think that's something that's really going to continue. We look at something like a company called California Cultured. They're growing cacao plant cells in fermenters to make chocolate ingredients. Now you might say, oh, Tony, that's more plausible or possible, which is a Star Trek Replicators is possible, but not probable. But they've just teamed up with Meiji, the largest chocolate manufacturer in Japan, to supply them ingredients. We're a company called Enough, making mycoprotein, which is a fungal protein. They've just been funded by Cargill. So we're seeing these alternative sources of ingredients coming to the fore, and I think it's highly probable that they're going to continue. And I think also looking at we look at low resource production. I mean, one of the things that we know is there's not enough arable land or fresh water on the planet to feed everybody in the world, particularly as we go towards 2050, the way that you and I will eat in Australia and the US. So I think that we're definitely going to see low resource food ingredients coming on. And Solar Foods has already had its Solein product approved in Singapore. If we push out a little bit more into our plausible futures, I think we're looking at far more siloing of food production. We've seen the rise of globalization, right? Where grow it here, ship it all around the world. And what we're seeing is countries are going, ooh, under COVID, there were problems in the supply chain. We're still seeing those problems today. So people are looking for food sovereignty. I would suggest people or countries like Singapore and Saudi Arabia are very food secure. They have enough money to buy whatever food they like, but they're not food sovereign. They're only food secure till somebody won't sell them the food. And so countries like that are going to look to be more food sovereign. And with current geopolitical tensions, I think food sovereignty is going to become a big issue for countries like China and even countries like India. Food sovereignty is going to come to the fore. And we could see a lot less export and globalization of food. And the other plausible one, I hate to say to some of our listeners, is the possible collapse of some of the animal agriculture sectors, particularly dairy, as some of these ingredients that they provide, like whey protein, or they feed into like infant formulas, get taken over by new technologies. And they're the high value parts. Whole milk's not high value, right? Values in the other parts, lactoferrins, it's in infant formulas, it's in all these other things. That 3% at the bottom of the bottle, figuratively speaking, that's the proteins and fats and everything else. that's in milk. And that's, I think, a quite plausible future. And I think another plausible one, maybe these days even edging into the probable, is a huge rise in gene editing of crops. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to grow crops the way that we currently do. And I think gene editing is going to become far more essential.
You just mentioned signal indicators that reference economic inputs, environmental inputs, geopolitical inputs, and technology advances. So when you're looking at the whole array and tying it back to the food system, how do you prioritize? Are there certain inputs that you prioritize higher than others when you're trying to pull this picture together?
Technology is the lens that I look through and then see how they're going to affect industry and consumers. And then within those, as you mentioned, you've got to look at the geopolitical consequences, you've got to look at the economic consequences, you've got to look at all of these inputs and see how are these technologies going to affect and be affected by these things. Because technology begets technology. Every technology is built on another technology, and that begets maybe 2 or 3 technologies or uses of that technology as we go on. And given my background in food science and technology, that's the lens through which I look to all these things as I scan the horizon, because I'm doing horizon scanning. What's at the cutting edge of what's going on? What are these signals of change saying to us about what the potential futures or the alternative futures could be?
When we were speaking before, personalization was a big focus of the conversation, and you mentioned genomics a few minutes ago. With the advances in genomics, the microbiome, how do you foresee these playing out in the process of consumer personalization evolving in food product development?
I think we've got 2 sides to personalization, Bill. One is the personalization of what I want my food to do for me. We've gone from subsistence food to tasty fuel to personalizations. I recently had my DNA analyzed by a company called nutrigenomics. And interesting, got my results back just last week, and it tells me I need more vitamin B12 than the average person. I should concentrate on that, as well as vitamin D. It also tells me I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. So 200 milligrams of caffeine is really what I should consume per day. So that's, and there's many other things in the report, but that's changing my view on the foods I'm going to look to for my genetics. And I haven't had my microbiome done yet. I think that's just coming to the stage now where it's accurate enough to be actionable, because that's the thing. And so looking at that, putting those things together, I can see that's definitely from a personal point of view, and I see it in the marketplace. People looking, say, well, I want food that's good for me. That might be good for you, Bill, but it's not good for me. And so that deeper level of personalization in food is going to be something that the industry is going to have to grapple with. Do they ignore it? Do they produce more products? You can't produce a product for every one of the current 8 billion people in the world. It can't be done. But can you break it, categorize it? Can you make 5 tomato soups instead of 1?
Speaking of consumers, you seem quite bullish on the impact of the next big demographic segment to come online, Generation Alpha. What makes this generation different? What do you see as their impact on the food system? And how should companies be preparing now to meet their expectations?
I think the key thing to remember about Generation Alpha, that's those born from 2010 to the end of this year, 2024, is they're not just digital natives, they are technology natives. Technology is everywhere in their life. They've never known a life without technology in pretty well everything. The only thing they don't see much technology in is probably their food. Now, do we see a future where Gen Alphas grow up, become adults and say, I want everything to have technology being personalized for me, but not my food. I'll just take whatever you want to give me. I find that an extremely unlikely outcome. And if we look at some of the work that's been done on the generations, we can test, because doing this sort of research on children is obviously frowned upon. But you look at Gen Z, I mean, something like 78% of them are comfortable with technology being used to make their food versus 57% at the other end for boomers. So if we project that trend, or if it stays the same, we've got a high probability that these Gen Alphas are going to accept technology in their food. And if we look at some of the technologies we just talked about, low arable land use, little or no fresh water use, highly sustainable, and those are the attributes that Gen Alpha are looking for. So that speaks to these new technologies. They're influencing a huge amount of purchasing already, even though the oldest of them is only 14 years old. So waiting for 2030 or 2040 to worry about them, going to be too late.
It's impossible today to talk about technology and innovation without a discussion about generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you envision the role of AI evolving in food technology? And what should companies be doing to prioritize in order to stay ahead?
Let's just be clear. Traditional AI we've been using for a long time, but the AI's outputs are determined by explicit human programming. With generative AI, what we're doing is the AI's output is determined by the patterns it finds in the data it's trained upon, and it produces novel output. And all companies across all industries are going to benefit from supply chain optimization, customer experience, et cetera. But in the food industry, it's that NPD, that new product development R&D side that's really going to benefit, primarily because an AI can conceive of and handle something that the human mind even can't comprehend. You can't give a food technologist 20,000 ingredients and say, give me the best combination of 5 that optimizes for sustainability, price, taste, et cetera. They'll either go mad trying to do it, or they'll come back in 100 years and give you the answer. But generative AI goes, a couple of 100,000 ingredients, 20,000, 2,000, I don't really care. It's another fraction of a second for me to work these out for you. Now, you still need humans to come along and make sure that what the AIs come up with is reasonable and actually works, but its ability to generate novel formulations and novel ways of looking at things to optimize formulations for new products is enormous. And it's going to shorten the time from an idea to on the market, on the shelf, is going to be dramatically reduced.
What are some of the practical implications of that?
Companies have got to look at where the power is in their supply chain relationship, because we've always said data's the new oil, right? It goes back for a long time, but it's even more important today because these AIs need data to be trained on. If you're a large CPG company, supply manufacturer, you've got all this in-house data, you could use that to train an AI. Now, you're going to use that to train your suppliers' AI, even with a contract, et cetera. You really want all your IP with your supplier. Or do you want to say, no, we now will look at our own generative AI and we'll have that in-house and we will take back some control of our products. And I think that's the question for companies, because the power of generative AI is so great that the power balance could really shift throughout the supply chain depending upon who's got control of the data and who decides to actually implement generative AI.
Tony Hunter is a global food futurist and strategic consultant based in Brisbane, Australia. You can read more about Tony's visionary perspectives in the July issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, Omnivore of California. Get inspired and learn more by visiting almonds.com/trends.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode. This is Omnivore.